All right, so I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about Dojo tonight. This is only my third meetup, STLJS meetup. When I first came 2 times ago, I was talking with Michael. I said, "Does anybody here have you ever done one on Dojo?" And he's like, "No, we've never done one on Dojo. We'd love that. It'd be great." So I signed up. So here I am. Maybe I'm a sucker. I don't know, but I'm here. All right. So Dojo, I chose this title kind of, it really is what I'm trying to imply here is that you can do so much more than just simply CSS selectors, right, querying with Dojo. It wasn't meant to be a poke at jQuery, but hey, maybe it is, right? We'll see. Just kidding. Right, we use the right tool for the job, right? And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. So let's dive in there. First, talk a little bit about myself. My name is David Spriggs. If you're interested, right, everyone's got to throw out their Twitter username. There I am, David Spriggs. I'm a huge JavaScript fanboy. I love JavaScript. I love good JavaScript particularly. I cut my teeth way back in the day, probably, I guess, 10 or 12 years ago now, with PHP, MySQL, and everybody's favorite POJS, right? Plain old JS, right? Plain old JavaScript, right? That's coined my friend over here, Gavin, term, I think. But I do right now work for Esri. I've been working for Esri for about 4 years, and ESRI is a fairly big company. I'll just give you a brief background. Our headquarters is in Redlands, California. We've got a big campus there, lots of buildings sprawling. There's about 2,500 employees there. There's cafeteria, gym, the whole works, right? Kind of like the Google campus. And it was founded in 1969. It's a still privately held company run by a guy named Jack Dangerman, who is well known in the geospatial world for our products, which is the ArcGIS, right? It's a desktop product and then also a server product that serve the desktop product is how you manage your geospatial data, and the server product is how you can then serve out that geospatial data and consume it in RESTful services and SOAP services and so on, right? And so some of the examples you're going to see tonight are how that works, right? So we have a lot of APIs actually. So I got this little. This is our home page, right? So esri.com is what it looks like. If you go to our resource center, I think we have a pretty nice resource center. We've got all kinds of, and this isn't showing up very big, you can't really see it, so let me zoom in here. We've got tons of APIs, but I wanted to focus on these 3 up in the top left corner, our web APIs. We have a JavaScript library, we've got a Flex library, and we have a Silverlight library, right? So
What's Silverlight?
I don't know. Yeah.
You sure?
Like I said, I'm a JavaScript fanboy.
That's the thing that Netflix uses.
Yes, exactly.
That's it.
Box themselves in there, yeah. But we also have native SDKs, what we call our runtimes for Android and iOS. If you want to make native apps, you can do that as well. So anyway, I just want to give you a little preview. But the important thing here is that we have a JavaScript API, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because our JavaScript API, we built it on top of Dojo. And there's some important reasons why we did that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, as we get into Dojo. So this, I thought was kind of funny. I found this on the internet, right? We've all been there and done this, right? When we kind of started when we first got started as developers, especially web development, right? We were duct tape geocoders, or duct tape coders rather, sorry. And it seems to work, right? So let's ship it, right? And we've all done that, right? Everybody, we just kind of do it. But as time goes on, right, we get better practices, better methods. And that's one thing I like about Dojo is that it has a lot of, it kind of helps you do better practices and have better code, right? The way it's formulated. So no more duct tape, it's time for Dojo, right? So at this point, actually I wanted to break out of this and show you a couple of sites that are written with Dojo. Anyone been to USPS.com? This is not the flashiest site in the world, but it is a nice site. You can see we've got a nice carousel here, right? Going here. We've got some nice menus. We click on this thing, we get this nice little pop-up box. You might look at this and say, wow, this was made with jQuery, right? It looks like jQuery. It's actually not. It's 100% Dojo. Now, you don't want to, the federal government, the post office, right, they're in trouble right now. And we all know this, right? But don't use that to gauge Dojo, right?
They're in trouble with it,
Another neat site that's done with all Dojo is Pottery Barn. I don't know if you guys are fans of Pottery Barn, but this site is also written with Dojo. Again, we have this big carousel here, and and all kinds of menus and stuff, right? So again, all done with Dojo. All right, well, let's go back to the presentation here and go to our next slide. So why did ESRI choose Dojo for its JavaScript API? Like I mentioned, we have a JavaScript API that connects to our backend server product. And we decided we were on the hunt for a JavaScript library to build our API on. This was back in 2007. And we looked around, we looked at jQuery, we looked at all the ones that are out there, Move Tools, whatever, and at Dojo. And the one that won was Dojo. And these are the reasons why, right? We needed to build it on top of something that was robust, something that's scalable, maintainable, modular, and fast, right? So these are some of the highlights of Dojo and what you can do, right? The module loading system, right? Long before AMD was even the hottest thing, Dojo already had this, right? So I remember when AMD first came out and everyone was like, oh, AMD, required JS, it's the thing, it's awesome. I'm like, yeah, we've been doing that for a long time, right? I mean, Dojo has a package module system built into it, always has. And so what that allows you to do is some actual object-oriented programming, kind of simulate that, right? Classes and inheritance, simple inheritance and things like that. So again, we're going to show examples of that here. Another big thing that made us choose it was awesome SVG graphic support. So when you're doing mapping applications, you need to draw things on the map oftentimes, and so that's all done with SVG, right? So we need a good support for that. Dojo is great for building enterprise level apps because, again, of the whole module loading system and everything. Fast development with the Digit UI, we're going to get into that, the whole Digit UI. This is it's equivalent to the jQuery UI, right? Library, but the Digit UI library is even more robust and bigger. Again, we're going to look at that. And again, Dojo is always very forward-looking, right? It's always built on the latest HTML standards and JavaScript standards and all these things that are coming out. For example, AMD, right? Another good example is promises and deferreds. Dojo, again, has had that for a long time. Another good example is pub and sub, right? There's a whole library. Who saw the meetup on going postal, right? That was an awesome library, right? Well, guess what? All that, it's in Dojo. Pub and sub library, right? So let's look at some of this stuff here. So what is inside Dojo? Now, again, I'm just going to look at a few things here. We're going to highlight a few things and kind of go through this really quickly. But first, I want to start with kind of how Dojo is organized, what it looks like, right? So you got three namespaces. You got the Dojo namespace, the Digit namespace, and the Dojo X namespace. So when you load Dojo, the dojo.js, you bring that in, you're going to have one global object called Dojo, and that's dojo dot, right? Is going to have all your methods off of that. And that's the core, or the base, right? But from there, you can start loading in other packages, other modules that are there for you from the Digit namespace or from the Dojo X namespace, or other libraries from the Dojo namespace as well. So that's kind of how it's broken down, and those are the three global objects that you'll have in your browser is Dojo, Digit, and Dojox. But of course, you only have the ones you load in, right? So by default, you only have Dojo. Any questions, or if I'm going too fast, just let me know. Okay. So what's in the base or the core, right? We got package loading, we got the event system, right, which includes pub and sub. We got all the AJAX transports, we got JSON handling, we got effects, and we got animations. We got a bunch of DOM manipulation tools, the CSS selector, query engine, right? Language enhancements. What I mean by that is standardization of the API across all browsers, right? Again, that's the whole point of a framework, right? Of a JavaScript framework is to abstract the browser, right? And so you get a consistent language enhancement regardless. A good example would be index of, right? Wasn't available in JavaScript like IE8 and below. I think it's JavaScript 1.8 that we got index of on arrays, right? But Dojo took care of that for you. It was going to be there for you, right? Or a method similar to it. So pub and sub, again, I mentioned that already. All right, so let's look at some quick examples of the stuff that's in Dojo. So here's some of the DOM APIs, right? We got dojo.query. This is the DOM node search selector, right? Equivalent to jQuery's dollar, right? Element name, dot, whatever you want to do with it, right? That's what dojo.query does for you. We got dojo.id, which gives you reference to a single DOM element. Dojo.doc is shorthand for the document object. Dojo.body, which returns the reference to the body element, right? Dojo.create, which is a great one. You can create any element you want using this method. And then dojo.place. You can create the element and then immediately place it somewhere with dojo.place. And place has some cool parameters where you can say place it in this element as the first or the last or the third one or the only one, right? There's lots of nice placement tokens you can use there. Then there's also dojo.destroy. which of course destroys that element and all of its children, and then dojo.empty, which just empties an element, right? So that's all your DOM stuff. I already talked about place, so we'll move on from that one. Here's a few more. Dojo.style again, right? You've got reference to some DOM node. You can update one or infinite number of elements, style elements on that thing. Add class, remove class. Does it have this class? And then margin box and content box, right? This kind of goes back to different ways, different rendering engines render things, right? So you can, there's also a method dojo.box model that tells you which one your browser's using, right? And then some DOM event control. You can event.prevent default. Those are Dojo automatically stick those on the event object for you. And then event.stop propagation. And then if you want to do both, you can just use dojo.stop event, passing in the event, right? So the difference is, right? Everyone knows the difference, right? So let's look at some code samples here. Dojo.connect. This is the event listener for Dojo. It's the main event listener. So let's look at some of these examples. So if you look at this first line here, we've got dojo.connect, and the first parameter is what you want to listen to. So we're listening to the body, and then the event you want to listen for, the on-click, and then your callback, right? So this anonymous function is going to be pass the event, and then we can just log that event, right? Now, dojo.connect will always return you a handle, right? As well. So then you can use that later to disconnect. So let's say we wanted a one-off click handler. We just say our handle equals a dojo.connect. We'll listen to some node, listen for the on-click event, and then when that fires, we're going to call dojo.disconnect and then a reference to our handle, and that will disconnect that, right? This is all pretty basic stuff. Dojo.connect, again, this last example. This one is neat because you can actually... Oh, sorry, you had a question?
So were you passing in some node there?
Yeah.
Can you pass in a selector string, or do you have to find the node first?
Well, you can just use your dojo.query right there if you want to. Yeah. Yep. Or dojo.by-id, right? If you know the idea already, right? So the dojo.query always returns an array, right? Whereas dojo.by-id returns just that actual element, right? So sometimes you might want one or the other, right?
So if you call query and you get back an array, then you have to pull out the first element.
Right. Yeah. Yep. So this last example, you notice there's this fourth argument, right? So we're saying dojo.connect, we're listening to foo, we're listening for the do something event, and then when that fires in the scope of bar, we're going to call do something else, right? So you can kind of change the scope or the context that the callback is going to fire at. This is pretty handy, right? Now, as a note here on this, I lost it. All right.
Well, I want to make sure I understand what that's actually saying. So
Yep.
say that slowly.
All right. I'll say it slower. So in dojo.connect, right, we're going to listen to foo, and we're going to do we're listening for do something, right? So when do something, the event fires on foo, we're going to call do something else, but we're going to call do something else in the scope or context of bar, right?
And what are foo and bar? I mean, are those event emitters? Or I mean, obviously they're emitting events, but if they're not, you said it could be other things than just DOM nodes.
Yep.
What kind of whose event emitter is that?
It could be another class if you have an instance of a class, right? And that's what I was going to mention is that this do something that you're listening for. This doesn't have to be just an event. That's the cool thing about dojo.connect. This can be any function.
Is it before or after?
I'm sorry?
So if say do something as a method on foo, is it going to call bar to do something else before or after?
After?
After.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an event listener.
Yeah, it's an event listener, yeah.
I
I said that, but maybe not loud enough. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always seemed missing in JavaScript frameworks. It's
Yeah.
like, you know, anybody that's ever done any heavy-duty action script, and you go and you're like, hey, I want this to, after this event bubbles or after this happens, do something, and it's like, does that know where you found it?
Right.
That's exactly what I was asking.
Yeah.
So those are methods on foo and bar. Those are.
And all the JavaScript guys are like, why
They
would
can be methods or they can be events. Yeah. So like for example, if foo was a div element, you could listen for the on-click, right?
Right. Dojo was written by !.
If foo was another object, like a function, that had, like a class that had member functions, right? This could be one of the member functions.
Right.
And when that gets called, you're going to call, this event
That
listener.
makes sense, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I apologize if I didn't make that clear. dojo.connect is the event listener.
That's
right?
the postal, that's the part that's similar to postal.
Well, not exactly. The dojo.pub, which is dojo.publish, and dojo.subscribe, those are the pub and sub.
Gotcha, so that's like a higher level than
Right.
than event listener.
Right, because see, this is tightly coupled, right? I'm listening to food, right, and I'm calling this, right? So they're tightly coupled. With pub and sub, it's loosely coupled, right? You're just, with subscribe, you're just listening to a channel,
Yeah.
and then with publish, you're just publishing out a message, right? So the object know nothing of each other, right?
So we'll do something else, except as an argument, the return value of do something. Are you piping the?
So, say it again.
Do something else.
Yeah.
Will it accept as an argument the return value of do something?
Yes. Yes, it's always, this thing will always be passed to the event or whatever that this thing was called with or passed, right? Yep.
As opposed to the return value? Or, I mean, does food do something past its return value to bar?
No.
Or, okay.
No, whatever do something was called with, if it was called with something,
Okay.
then it'll be passed to do something.
Oh, okay.
So it could be any object that just hops the fence and then all of a sudden it's inside of that new space.
Yep.
Even more generally than event listener, it's like an interceptor into anything that can be intercepted.
Right.
And it looks like doing something like that, and that line would be like doing like a chain and
Yep.
underscore and chain whatever.
Sure. And you can have multiple connects on foo, right? And it's going to fire those connects in the order that you attached them to foo, right? So if you got 5 listeners on foo, it's going to call out 5 of those in that order that you put them in, right? All right, any other questions there? It was a good discussion. Okay. All right, so dojo.hitch. This is probably one of my favoriteest functions in Dojo because it does exactly like what it sounds, right? And so in the asynchronous world of JavaScript, right, oftentimes you're making an AJAX call, an asynchronous call to the server, and when that data comes back, your callback normally, right, is going to just go in the global. It's going to execute in the global, right? Well, what if you don't want that? What if you called your AJAX call, your asynchronous call deeper down in some class, right? And you want the return to come back to that class or in the scope of that class, right? And that's what Hitch does for you, right? So let's walk through this. We got this object Robert that has a name and then a say name function, right? It's just gonna console log out this.name, right? So it's inside of this scope, right? It can do that, right? So we say Robert.sayName, it logs Robert, obviously, right? But now if we say Robert.sayName equals Robert.sayName, and then we say Robert.sayName, it's going to log nothing, right? Because the name now is no longer in that scope, right, of Robert's say-name. Follow?
I don't follow. I'm sorry. Why is this is basic? I realize it's not the topic we're talking about.
Okay.
Why?
Well,
doesn't it know
because Robert's say-name equals this up here, Robert say-name, right?
Right.
So now it's just this function, and this.name no longer exists in there, right? Because it's not in there anymore, right? So I can hitch it, right? I can say Robert say-name equals dojo.hitch in the scope of Robert, call Robert.sayName. Now when I do Robert.sayName, I'm going to get Robert, right? Because Robert.sayName is now being called in the scope of Robert, which is the whole object, right?
So it's like an apply, but it hangs around post the application.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Now,
bind,
right.
before bind means it's there.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the thing is that dojo.hitch, when you call dojo.hitch, this right here, this dojo.hitch, returns a function. So now Robert's say-name is a function, right? So dojo.hitch always returns a function. It's going to call the function you passed in the scope of the first parameter that you passed in, right? Make sense? So it's very handy. Like we use this all the time when we're making asynchronous calls to a server to get some data, but we want that data to come back in a certain scope, right, of an object, right? So that's a great function. Any questions there? Okay. So I thought I would just show some real simple dojo.query examples because I know that probably a lot of us have done jQuery here, right, and are familiar with the way that works, right? So just want to point out that we've got all that same capability, right? So here's some really simple examples. dojo.query, right? Give me the element that's got the ID of ID, right? Or get all the divs that are all the first child of the divs, right? Or all the code elements with the example class, right? CSS class, or just all the elements with the example class in them, right? These are some pretty simple ones.
Any notable differences between jQuery's and Dojo's query engine?
Honestly, I don't use jQuery a whole lot, so you have, Gavin, any notable differences?
Not a ton that I've seen.
Okay. Maybe as we walk through some of these, we'll see them.
Yeah.
But here's just some speed tips, right? Kind of things you can do, right? You obviously don't want to necessarily do that. One thing that's nice about dojo.query is you can say, look for all the A tags, but start at this element, right? So you can kind of quarantine your search. Instead of searching the whole DOM, you want to just start here because that's where you know you need to find all your A tags, right? So you can also, of course, dojo.query, get all the divs, and then add this class, get all the divs, set the style, right? Display none. You can kind of optimize that by saying divs equals dojo.query A, and then divs add class, divs set style, or just chain them all together like you would in jQuery, right? Divs dot add class dot set style, right? So again, very similar, right? Any questions there? So the result of a dojo.query is what we call a node list. And the cool thing about a node list is it has its own API. And not only does it have its own API, but it's also extendable, right? So you can actually create your own bulk operations, right, on these node lists. So it has all the standard, right? It returns a true JavaScript array. It's got all the for each, the map, index of, last index of, every, some, right, all that stuff. Some bulk operations are .style, .add class, .remove class, place, orphan, adopt, right? And then we also have a more advanced, you can do simple animations, but then we have advanced animations where you can do fade in, fade out, animate properties and stuff like that, right, in bulk. Any questions on that? I was mentioning extending, right? So anybody in here use the Kendo UI? Anybody looked at that? It's another interesting UI library that they build off of jQuery. And so when you have the Kendo UI, you get dollar, right, element, and then you can say dot Kendo chart, right? And it will create a Kendo chart in that element or whatever. And so that's what I was saying about you can extend the node list API to make your own stuff like that, right? With Dojo, you can say dojo.query, get back a node list, and then say maybe dot create my chart, right? And then with your own method that would do some bulk operations.
How do you install those methods, and how do you customize them?
Well, just like you'd write any other class, you
So you can just, in other words, you just derive it from, you're just saying you can derive it from that node list.
Right. It's basically going to give you a for each operation on the whole node list, right? So you can just basically do whatever you want and extend that.
Okay.
But do it as a module, right? That's kind of modular.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, so all the AJAX transports, Dojo XHR, right? These are all the AJAX transports in Dojo. There's quite a few of them. You got Dojo form to JSON, form to object, form to query, object to query, query object, right? You get the idea. The XHR get and post are the most common ones. And again, these, of course, only work on the same domain, right? The browser imposes the security, right? So Dojo also has a JSONP implementation called dojo.io.script.get, and that's where you can do some JSONP, just uses a script tag with a callback, JSONP to get that data back to you, right? The nice thing about Dojo is it handles all the cleanup for you, right? You call this, it creates the script tag, gets the data. When it gets back, it destroys that script tag. So you don't end up with 50 million script tags in your head, Any questions on that? All right. Actually, what we've done at ESRI, we have our own method called esri.request. And what we've done there is we've wrapped io.get and get and post and all these different things. We've wrapped them in this bigger object that it says, okay, the request I'm about to make is a cross-domain. Does it need to be and what's the length of the URL? If it's a get, browsers have limits on the length of a get, right? Like Internet Explorer is 1,024 characters or something like that. Firefox is 4,000 characters, right? So if the request is a get, if it's asking to do a get, but the URL is too long, it says, I can't do this, I need to do it through a post, so it'll do a post instead, right? So we've kind of have this smarter object that knows based off the destination and what you're trying to do, which of these methods to use, right? So you don't really have to think about it. And it also incorporates a proxy page so that if you're doing a cross-domain post, it'll handle that for you too, right? So that's pretty nice. All right, well, let's finish this up real quick. Just lastly with this idea of inheritance, okay? This is the, of course, JavaScript itself uses prototype inheritance, right? Which can get kind of messy and verbose. So Dojo has a helper method for this called dojo.declare, and it works pretty easily. You simply say dojo.declare. The first parameter is the object name, and this could be a namespace, right? So you could say my app, app.utils.fetch or something, right? And that's going to be the name of this class. And then the next parameter here, this array, is going to be anything that you want to inherit from, right? So the first one's going to be your superclass, and then the other ones will be mix-ins, right? Now, if you don't want to inherit from anything, you can just put a null there, and you don't have to inherit from anything. So we do that quite a bit. We'll just put a null here, and just have our own class that doesn't inherit from anything, right? But then the last input here is an object. It's going to be all of your member properties and functions, right? And you need to have a constructor function because anytime you create a new instance of one of these things, that constructor is going to be called, obviously, right? Any questions about this? Pretty straightforward.
Is there a way to distinguish between instance methods and class methods?
I'm not sure I follow.
Well, so if I'm doing this in regular JavaScript, then I'm going to have a constructor function. Then I'll attach some things directly to that. Those will be like class methods. And then if I say that class name .prototype something, that'll be an instance method, and so I can have both kinds attached to it.
So basically functions would have that object namespace.
Well, that's what these are, like the echo function.
Isn't that really, echo is really a prototype?
No, it's not.
It's not.
One thing Dojo does not do and will never do is mess with the prototype, ever. That's one of the foundational principles of Dojo is that we don't mess with the prototype because it can get messy, right? If you're using other libraries and stuff, you can have conflicts and it can cause problems.
Not the host object prototypes. He's talking about like if you were to say like new object name,
Right.
you could then take that and say like like say var x equals new object name, passing whatever parameters to the constructor, and then calling x.echo.
Right, so I think what you're saying is when I call new to create a new one of these objects, I pass in some parameters. Yeah, that's going to come into my constructor. We just don't have anything here for that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but you can call x.echo on that, correct?
On what now?
So if you save that after whatever the constructor returned, you save that into a variable x.
This constructor is not going to return anything.
Aren't you going to say new object name to create an instance of that class?
You could. But it's just going to be a reference to that instance.
Right. And
so then I can
call
say,
echo on the instance.
so if I say like, yes, absolutely. So if I say var app equals new object name, then my app is going to have app.echo, app.some property, right?
Right. But, well, I guess if I want class level methods, I can just attach them to object name. I could say object name.food equals some function. And then that would be something that isn't on the instance because it's on the class itself.
I got you, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, it took me a minute to catch up to you, yeah.
So inside the class definition, you don't declare both kinds of methods. You just declare the instance methods.
Right, well, it's, no, in the declare, we're defining the class. So anytime I declare new, it's always going to have all these methods and properties. Right. Now, that instance I created, I could attach some new functions and properties to it later. And then when I call new, to make a new one of these later, it's not going to have any of those. Right. Right.
The difference is which ones are going to be on that instance and which ones are going to be on a prototype. So that like if you create 1,000 instances of that object, if it's a prototype, there will be one instance of that in memory, whereas there would be 1,000 instances of the instance method.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to look at that. I don't know if I can answer that exactly. I don't think, like I said, it doesn't do prototype. It doesn't affect the prototype. So.
Well, I would be very surprised if, because I understand what you're saying about not affecting the prototype, like not modifying the prototype to say the array object or something. But I would be very surprised if the echo function, for example, were not on the prototype of the object.
Yes. I think it would
They
be.
actually do what Mootools does, is they actually wrap every function, every one of the instance functions inside of the one that creates it, because they need to have the stat inherited exist inside of that function.
Yeah.
So it's wrapped and sets it, and then unsets it after the function's over.
Yeah. That's true. There's a lot of other methods. Well, we can get to later. If you're inheriting from like a widget, like if you're going to create a dojo digit, you would inherit, your superclass would be digit._widget, which is kind of the base thing, and then you would call this that inherited like on your post create function and different things, right? All right, well, let's move on here. I think I want to get to the code here. So why does Dojo rock? Well, this is again my opinion. I think Dojo is awesome. I've been coding with Dojo for 4 years, and I never have once had to bring in a secondary library. I've always found what I've needed in Dojo, and that's just me, right? So it's a unified toolkit across the web and the mobile. That's one thing we're going to look at later, is that there's a DojoX mobile library, right, for writing mobile apps. There's a rich set of UI widgets, grids, charts, carousels, data stores, lots of complex stuff that's made very simple. You got the base API, right, for browser extraction, DOM. We went through all that stuff, animations, and of course it's open source. So that's the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Dojo. There's tons more, right? There really is. I mean, that's just scratching the surface, like I said. So at this point, let's do some demos and look at some code, right? One of my colleagues here said I should have put a picture of like NC Hammer up here, right? It's my joke. It's demo time. No one got it though. So. All right. So let's jump out of here. Let's close this. What I wanted to show off was an application that we wrote. Oh, and by the way, the code we're going to be looking at and the code samples we were just looking through is pre-AMD Dojo, right? I mentioned that in version 1.7 and 1.8 of Dojo, AMD was introduced, and the whole library is kind of being refactored and everything. And so, what I'm showing you today, I'm not showing you any AMD stuff, because a lot of the apps, all the apps we've written today, are not AMD, and mainly that's partly our own fault, the SRI, because our JavaScript library is built on top of Dojo, right? So we can't fully implement AMD in our API until we get all of our API objects AMD compliant, right? So we're kind of a release behind there, but it's in the works and it's happening. So eventually we'll be able to start building our apps with AMD once that happens, right? So the reason why I want to show you this Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission app is because it was built completely with the Digit framework. There's not a single bit of UI design or element design or anything that we did here. We just simply used out-of-the-box Digit framework. So, like for example, the sign-in box. This is an out-of-the-box, it's called a digit.dialog, right? It's just a dialog box, a modal dialog box. And it's got these nice, it's using what's called a digit.form that had two digit.text box and a password box. And you can see that we automatically get this validation. It's all built in. You don't have to do anything. That's why I love the Digit framework. You just create a form digit, put your digit elements in there, and you get the validation out of the box, right? So I can hit OK all day long on this, and I'm never going to get anything until I put in my credentials here. Now this app, while it's signing in here, I'll just explain to you what it does. Indiana Regulatory Commission, they had a need to, they regulate the utilities, and mainly the electric companies, right? So across the state of Indiana, you've got all these electric companies, they all have a boundary, right? And sometimes there's disputes or whatever, or they need to change the boundaries. So this app is meant for the utilities to use, sign in, and they can draw on the map and delineate and say, well, this area is actually in, it's in this guy's, it's in this other electric utilities, but it really should be in our boundaries, right? It should be in our territory, right? So they're kind of fighting over customers, basically. Or maybe a new subdivision got built and it makes more sense for someone else to service that area, whatever. So they wanted a way for the utilities to enter those they call them a cause, and to kind of manage those. So real quick, right? So this is called a tooltip dialog, right? So I can just click on this button, and I get this nice tooltip dialog that pops up. This is using a wizard. Again, these are all tooltip. Here's a data grid. This is a base map widget. Let's just switch this. All right, so our API, again, it's a lot like Google Maps, right? I mean, that's the idea, right? Is we're doing some mapping. We're mapping geospatial stuff. There's some tools here for printing the map and measuring and drawing. I was talking to you guys earlier about SVG graphics, right? Let me show you an example. I'm going to use the autocomplete tool, and what autocomplete's going to do is use this black boundary to finish a box I'm going to draw. So again, we're using SVG graphics here, right, in the browser to draw these things. We're going to click right there. What I do? We can also do some snapping. That's my little brow there. Okay. So let's go zoom in right here. I just clicked wrong. Let's do autocomplete right here. So let's say this subdivision needs to be part of this area over here, right? Click on that, and we actually made a call to our backend server to do some geometry measurements, and now this polygon is right up against that black line. There's no what we call slivers, right? Anyway, then we can input some information about this cause. Here, we'll save that. Now this is actually saved, and you saw it show up in my box here, right? So there's some things going on in the background here. There's what we call a feature layer that holds the contents of this grid, and it's also representing this thing on the map. And so these things are bound together. So that's why when I hover over the cell, I can see it being highlighted on the map, right? Stuff like that. You can click on it, get some information about it. If I'm an admin, I can review this cause. This is the kind of little form, right? This is a custom class where we inherited from the digit.dialog. We said, all right, we want a mobile dialog, so let's inherit from that. And then we customized it by adding in our own content in here in the middle. And just have some basic stuff we're controlling. Maybe you want to set this to decided. Looks good. Save that. Now our merge cause button is active, right? I'm not actually going to do that, but there we go. So let's look at this app. How did we build this app, right? There's another dialog up here if you want to send some feedback. So I guess you can see. Let's do a PDF. Print that. Now this little widget here that we made is kind of neat. This part up here creates a request to a print service, and it serializes the map, the state of the map, where the extent and everything, the objects in it, and we call print. And we send that up. That's an AJAX request, and we actually create a deferred object for that. And we send the deferred object to this little widget. We make a new widget that has reference to that deferred, and then when that deferred completes, we just saw. We get a reference to the actual PDF that's sitting on the server that we can now download just by clicking on this link, right? So again, I was talking about how Dojo has this concept of deferreds and promises in it, right? So now we have our little PDF map here that we created. But I just wanted to point out kind of how this was working, right? So I can fire off a bunch of these, and now I've got these 4 deferred objects that are waiting in these kind of sub little widgets. All right, so let's take a look at this code and see what's going on. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, it's really, really great. How much of that is digit? How much of it is ESRI? I can't wait to look at it.
Yeah, so all of the UI, everything you're seeing, that's all digit.
Digit can draw polygons like that?
That's dojo.gfx. It's the SVG library. Yeah. The Dojo graphics library, GFX.
And then do you guys use your own proprietary code to calculate the proportions or volume or whatever?
Yeah, we do have some methods that can, tell us, how many acres that is or whatever, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so that kind of geospatial stuff, yeah, that's all in our API, right? Yeah. But like drawing that polygon, of course, we have what we call a draw toolbar class. It's a drawing toolbar that we've implemented using the dojo, the class, declaring a class and so on, right? So I've just created one of those so I could draw a map, right? But under the hood, it's using dojo.gfx library, right? Yep. Which is one of the reasons why we chose Dojo, because it had the good support for that, right? All right, let's look at some code. I think we're running out of time here. So first, I'll show you what the index looks like. It's standard boilerplate HTML5 here, just the doc type, right?
David, can you go up the process?
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe. I use Antana, by the way. It's based off Eclipse. And you guys are all probably thinking, this dude is lame because his IDE has a white background, right? Well, I'm sorry, I'm from the old school. I just can't get used to the black background, right? Like I said, I've been doing this for 12 years, so. Let me see if I can figure out how to...
Control plus.
Control plus, let's try that. Window, reference window. I think it's probably in editors. Anybody know Eclipse really well?
Just type up in the filter text box. Font. I think it's basic.
Text font. Go like 14 maybe? Yeah, that's good. Is that better? Want to go bigger?
No, that's good.
Okay.
Not sure we have time.
Yeah, so you can see that in our body, we're not really pulling a lot of HTML here. We're pulling in this kind of loading div, right, to kind of show to the user we've got this loading graphic and a little loader bar GIF. But then we bootstrap Dojo here, and we actually host our API in our CDN here, our server API, RTS Online. So we bootstrap it there, and then after that's loaded, we have another script here that's going to set the base URL. It's going to register a module path, and again, this is pre-AMD. It's different now in the AMD versions. Instead of a module path, it's now called a package, right? And but we're going to register this module path. Basically, what we're saying is that anytime I ask for a class that starts with a GIS, that maps to lib/GIS, right? And so then we're just going to require in our controller class. The way we write our apps is using the kind of controller method. It's not quite MVC at all, but it's better than not MVC because, as you'll see, we create this controller class, and then the controller instantiates all the views and all the digits and widgets and everything all programmatically, right? And then is tightly bound, the UI is tightly bound into the controller, and we can kind of control everything and have access to it. So anyway, you'll notice there's a dojo.ready. Now what this does, of course, is just like jQuery, document ready, right? We're waiting for the DOM to be ready, and as soon as it's ready, we've got this function here. So ready also will only fire after all of the required and all of its dependencies have loaded, right? So we could be loading in maybe 10 or 20 modules, and our ready is not going to fire until all those modules have been loaded, right? Once it's loaded, we just create a new instance of our controller, and of course in the constructor that's going to kick everything off, right? So let's go ahead and go look at that. So lib.js, IURC, and then here's our controller. So the dojo.provide at the top, that's part of the module loading system. We're letting the module loader know that we have loaded this module. So that if someone else ask for it later, I know I've already got it loaded, right? So we provide the module, we say there it is, and then any dependencies that the declare is dependent on, we're going to go ahead and require those in as well. So this module is dependent on the js.rurc.modules. And I do this because I like to separate all my dependencies into a different file so I can kind of manage them. So let's look at the modules JS. You can see this is where I'm bringing in all the goodies that I need, right? So I'm bringing in the item file read store, the object store, memory store. Here's my digit.layout.border container. Again, Dojo is always ahead of its time. The border container digit is a great semantically kind of driven container. Just like with HTML5, you've got header, left and right, and footer, right, in the center sections. Dojo's been doing that for a long time. With the border control container, you can say, here's a div and I want it to be the header, and here's, I want this to be center, I want this to be left, and it'll just automatically do that for you, right?
Are those loaded serially, or are they loaded in parallel and there's a fallback once they all load?
These are loaded synchronously. That's the only bad thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's why, of course, AMD is the future, right? Because then we can start loading these things asynchronously and speed things up a little bit, right? So that's a good question. But you can see we're just loading at the bottom here. This is where we're loading in our custom classes that we have ourselves written, right? So in our JS namespace, IURC, we've got a find class, and edit, and geocode, bookmarks, and so on, right? All these different classes we wrote. And we like to do it this way because we might have 2 or 3 guys working on a project, and we can just assign them a class that you have to write, you know, that everyone's writing, and so it's a lot easier to kind of bring things together at the end. You're working on certain modules, you know. So let's just look at the controller real quick. So we've got this big controller. It's got some member variables, properties. Here's the constructor. We're going to set some things here with our API. And this is kind of something that a little trick I do just for development. I take this, being the controller, and I push it out globally to a variable called app. And I do that so that in Firebug, right, in my console, I have access to the controller via the app variable, right? So the idea is this is for development, and when I'm done, I can get rid of that, and then there's really nothing where you can still get to it. But
And do you use the connect tool to then monitor and see what methods are firing, things like that? Would that be an example?
well, in Firebug, you can just put watch statements on certain variables, or just
Oh, right, okay, that's what you said.
in Firebug console, yeah. So that's again just for development. We just do that as a trick. But anyway, then we kick off Vista and Knit UI, right? So this is what's going to build our view, right? So again, here's that border container. And so we have this header, it's going to be a content pane. Just think of content pane as a very fancy div that has all kinds of cool functions on it. It's aware of other widgets around it that are going to participate in this border container, right? So we give it a region on top, so that's going to be our top region. And you notice it has an href, right? So these containers or these divs automatically load their content via an AJAX call, right? I just assign it a URL and I move on. It's going to do the rest for me, right? And then I'm going to place this thing in outer, which that's my border container, right? Now I'm going to create this map region. I'm going to put it in the center. I'm going to place that in the outer. And then eventually we call startup, and that's what's going to actually instantiate our UI and our view, right? But we also, because these containers are loading their content via an AJAX call, we need to know when that happens so that we can make sure that content is actually in there before we continue on with a few things. So we just put a dojo.connect on the map container. We're going to listen for onload. When that onload fires, then we're going to load the config, right? So it's just a way to make sure we continue everything present. So here we load the config. We just use I disconnect that handler because I don't want to make sure I don't want to load that again at some point in the future. Probably never would, but anyway, it's there. Then we do a dojo xhr get where we're going to go fetch our JSON config file. It's another way we build our apps is completely configurable. We don't want anything in the actual code that you got to go hunt for later, right? We want it to all be in a config file. So I'll show you what that looks like. This is the initial config, very simple. It's got where the proxy page is at, the base URL, and so on. Here's what the full config looks like, right? We've got a star extend, a bunch of services, URLs to a bunch of services, right? Anyway, so this is going to go through, and I don't want to, unless you guys want me to, we can kind of dig into this line by line, but I think that's probably more than we want to do. But I'll just point out a few interesting things. You know, we got some deferreds that we're that we're, nice thing about deferreds is they have a method called then, right? So I create a deferred by making an AJAX call, and then I can say deferred.then, right? Which I'm just essentially going to attach a callback and an error back, right? To my deferred. So here I'm doing a hitch, and this is the callback. So when I get the credential back from the login, then I'm going to call this get user roles using that credential, which is another method, because now that we've authenticated you, we need to call a number service to figure out what level of user you are in the app, right?
Right, so let me make sure I'm understanding the call.
Okay.
The deferred, the then call is accepting a function reference that is created by dojo.hitch.
Correct. Yep. And then actually accepts two parameters. The first one being the callback, and the second one being the error back. And in this case, I'm only giving it a callback. So anyway, this is kind of the sign-in process. Here's the get user roles again. And then once everything's good, we actually load the real config, and then we start initting the map, right? This is kind of the ESRI stuff where we start building the actual map itself, the map control, right? And this actually is setting up some menus. If you notice on the map, I can right-click, and I get this little menu, right? So that's all being built programmatically also by what's called a digit.menu right up here. And I'm putting it in the map node, and then I'm going to build some menu items, right? And I can put in separators, and I can do all kinds of cool stuff, and I can hitch up the click events for those certain functions, right? So, I mean, that's what I really wanted to show here was just kind of the controller method and how we do this, right? Using a class. So the controller itself is a class, and then as we scroll down, actually, you know, so if you look on the left here, we've got all these other modules we've written, right? So in init widgets, let's see, where is that? Let's see. Did I lose it? Oh, here they are. All right, so here we're making, we're saying this.edit, and we're creating a new js.irc edit, a new cause, which right, so this is bringing all those modules and creating instances of those classes as children of the controller, right? And then, of course, these are the configs for it. So the way, we're going to get into this in our next little sample. So I'm going to close this unless there's any other questions you guys have. I'm going to move on to something a little bit simpler, a little more interactive. All right. All right, so let's close all these. And let's go here and look. We put together a little thing for the meetup here. So where's my meetup? Meetup. All right, so we got this little basic viewer here. Again, same things going on, except this is now using the EMD style packages. We're just defining our package here now in this little dojo config object. We define the packages. If you're doing custom packages, you have to define this dojo config object first before you do your bootstrap. When it bootstraps, it's going to look for this object for its config. If it's not there, it's not going to break. You're just not going to have your packages, right? It needs to know where the packages are. So we do that, we bootstrap, and then we say dojo.require our controller. When the DOM's ready, everything's loaded, then we create a new instance of our controller. And the way I like to organize things, I don't think you can see that very well, but we've got our lib, we've got a GIS namespace, and then in there we've got a digit namespace and a viewer namespace. The viewer namespace contains classes that are specific to this app that you're not really ever going to reuse anywhere else, right? Whereas our digit namespace, these are going to be digits that we've built that can really go in any app, right? Because we build a lot of mapping apps, and we have a lot of, like the print widget, right? That's something we can reuse anywhere on any app, right? So that's in our digit namespace, so they can be moved around a lot easier. So if you look in here, there's two digits we've got in here, is a geolocation and a growler. And that's what I wanted to show you just real quickly is the growler widget. It's kind of a neat little widget. It's real easy to make in Dojo, and I'll just kind of show how we made that digit. Look at the controller here really quick. Under the viewer here, we're just initting the UI very simply here. We just have a border container with a left section and a right section. And we load the config, we init the map. You can see when we do that, we also create this growler. So this is a new js.digit.growler. And when you create a true Dojo digit, you're inheriting from digit._widget, and then there's another class you can mix in called digit._templated, which means not only is this a widget, but it also has UI. It has a UI component to it, and so you can load in a template for that UI, right? Which makes it very nice, and I'll show you how that works. So the two arguments then are, what are the properties for your widget, and then where do you want this thing to live in the DOM? So we've got in our overlay over our map, we've got a div here called the growl container, and then another div. This is the growler widget. So this div is going to become that growler widget. So the way I decided to implement the growler was, if we look in growler.js here. So again, we're providing this so the loader system knows we've got it loaded, and then we're requiring our _widget and our _templated. And now this is just a little closure here to load in the CSS that might be specific to this widget, right? Everybody knows what's going on there, right? That's pretty boilerplate, I think, right? We're just creating, we're getting a hold of the head, we're creating a link tag.
So every widget has its own style sheet, or can have.
It could have its own style sheet, right? So this is just a quick and easy method to inject that style sheet in, right? Some people might choose not to do that. If you know you're going to use this widget, just go ahead and do it. But we like to make our widgets completely freestanding so that anyone can just grab this code, throw it in, and it's going to inject the CSS it needs right out of in the growler folder there. You'll see it's got a CSS folder, right? So it's all together, all modular, right? It all moves around together. So this module URL says, in this namespace, go get the CSS growl, here's the full path, right? So that's a nice little method, the module URL method. Anyway, so here's where we actually declare. I decided to do this in two classes, right? Because I thought about it. I said, well, the growler, I need like a manager, something that's going to manage the growls, that's going to know where they should be placed and know how to create them, right? And then I want to have an actual growl itself that's going to be the actual growl widget, or the thing that we see, right, on the screen. So this is my growler, or the growl manager, if you will. It's inherited from widget, and it's templated. It has a very simple template. It's just a div. But it has this special thing in here. It's called it's data. Again, this is using HTML5, right? A data tag is an actual valid HTML tag. But we're saying data-dojo.attach point, and then we give it a name, container node. Now what that means, that attach point, means that inside this widget, or inside this class, or an instance of the class, you'll be able to say this.container node, and it will be a reference to this div, right? That's why it's called an attach point. Make sense? It's pretty slick, right? So then we have this growl function, and we just pass in some properties. Then we're going to mix in, dojo.mixin is another great function, right? The idea with dojo.mixin is that the first object is going to be the parent, if you will, and then the in number of other objects are just going to be all the properties from those objects are going to be mixed in onto the first object, right? There's no copying going on. It's actually bringing those properties over to the original panel. So basically we're saying, okay, I've got these properties that were just passed in. I'm going to mix in this other property called container. It's going to be this.container node, right? So now, effectively what I'm doing is I'm adding the container node to the properties, because I'm going to call eventually growler.growl to create a new growl, right? So now that's how I kind of pass on the container node to that growl itself. So then we call new jsdigit.growl, right? Passing in those props. So now the growl itself has everything it needs to know about where it needs to live, and then it's going to take care of the rest. Right here, so let's scroll down and look at the actual growl itself. Again, it's inheriting from widget and templated. Now its template is a little bit more complex. I'm not going to do it inline. I'm going to actually use a cool function called dojo.cache. And what dojo.cache does is it will again do an AJAX call to fetch some HTML snippet, but then it caches it. So if I ever ask for this again, it's going to say, hey, I've already got this, and it's just going to hand me the string, right? So that's really handy. So every time I create a new instance of one of these things, it's not having to do an AJAX call to fetch that HTML, right? It's already cached. So I've got some member properties here, title message, some, a timeout, and opacity. And of course, those could all be properties that are passed in as well, right? They would be mixed in. So here's the post create. This is in the whole life cycle of a underscore widget, there's a whole series of functions that go off. One that creates the DOM element, right? But the post create is right after the DOM's been created, but it hasn't been placed in the DOM yet, right? So we can do some things, kind of mess with stuff and get it ready before we actually place it in there. So we call this .inherited arguments so that our superclass post create also gets called at that point. And then we say if we have a container defined, which we will, then we're going to say dojo.style this.dom node. Again, that's another shorthand for this. The DOM node for this thing has already been created from the template, and that's how we reference it, is this.dom node, right? And we're going to say, we're setting the style of that to opacity 0 because we don't want the ground just to show up. We're actually going to fade it in, right? So before we place it in the DOM, we're setting the opacity to 0. Then we're going to place it in the DOM, so we're placing this.dom node in this.container. And then we're going to animate it. So we're going to say dojo.animate this.dom node opacity to this.opacity, which is going to be 0.85. And we'll do that in 250 milliseconds, right? So we animate, that's how we animate that thing in, right? And then we call this.setTimeout. And the this.setTimeout is just going to call a function, right? Because that's how growls work, right? They show up, they stay there for however long, and then they fade back out, right? So we got this.setTimeout. We also have this hover over, so if we hover over it, we're going to clear the interval and add a class. It kind of highlights it, right? Then when we hover out, we're going to call this.setTimeout to reset our timer and then change that class again, right? And of course, there's a close function that's going to animate the dialog out. And then this is, if you know dojo.admin, this last function is like the on-end handler, right? So once that animation is finished, we're going to call remove, but again, we're using the hitch there because that animation is asynchronous, right? So we need to hitch it back here so it can be called in the right context, right? So anyway, then we're going to actually destroy this thing, and we're done.
Can you show us a growl action?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so this is our app. We'll just load it up here. And I'm going to click on Find Me because I showed you in there was a geolocation widget, and that's what this one does, right? It just has a button as the only UI element that it has. And when we click that, it's going to use the browser's geolocation object to actually find where I'm at. So let's click that. And what we'll do is we're going to growl out the location, right? So we'll say share, and there's our growl, right? So let's do a couple of these. We can kind of see how these work. All right, so there's our widget.
Can you show the hover?
Yeah. So as long as I'm over it, it's never going to disappear, right?
Right.
Because I'm hovered over it. And you can see all I did was I just changed the border. I don't know if it's showing up very well. I think I changed the border size or color or something. Then I can click on it, of course, and that'll close it, right? You can also go to the console. And like I said, for testing, this is where we push the controller out to app, right? So I can say app.growler.growl. And we can just pass in an empty object here, and we should get the defaults, right? So we'll just do that a bunch of times. And so on, right? So you're probably wondering, well, how did those on-hover and on-hover out events get set up, right? Let's look at the template for the growler itself. And you'll notice that I've got an attach event, dojo data, or data dojo attach event. And again, those are those cool things that the templating system give you. So basically you can do all these events. You can say, so basically in here we're just saying on mouse hover, or on mouse over event, hook that up to our hover over function. On mouse out, hook that up to hover out, right? And so on, you click, hook that up to close, right? So all that happens automatically when you create a new instance of the widget. Pretty
Why
slick.
would you do those here instead of in the code?
Why would I do
Why
that?
would you do them in the template instead of in the code? code that was already doing a lot of other.
Well, this is just connecting the events, right? It's a attach event. So maybe I don't understand your question, but we have the method there, hover out and hover over and hover out. But
Can you do the attachment there? Or do you have to do it?
I could do it here, yeah, but it makes more sense just to let the template system do it, right?
It starts to look like a declarative binding
Yeah.
in the template itself, as opposed to being.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And to me, it's a really nice, slick feature because you're right. I could come in here and I could say, okay, dojo.connect, DOM node, this.dom node, whatever, and then call the hover. All right, but that's a whole other extra line of code that I have to write, right? Let the dojo do that for you. All right.
How long
Now-
did that app take you?
What's that?
Sorry if I cut you off. How long did that app take you, this little mini app?
This little basic viewer. Not very long at all. I mean, yeah, I'd say maybe 3 hours or so. Just kind of put it together. All these different things. If you look at the geolocation class, right? Again, its template is just a button that we put up there in the right-hand corner, but then it has these different methods like geolocate, location success, location error, and then add the graphic, right? So that's what actually adds that dot. When we have a success, it adds a dot to the map for us, right? So again, these are all very modular, right? They can be moved around to any app very easily, written by different developers. So to close here, I thought I'd do something kind of fun. I'm going to make a modification to our controller here. And I've got a little snippet here. But we thought it'd be fun to see where everyone in the meetup comes from, right? In other words, your hometown. So we built a little mobile app, and I'll have you guys go to this URL on your smartphone. Type in your hometown. You can just do like city name, state, or like zip code or something like that. It doesn't matter. It'll give you a list you can pick from. And then we'll kind of watch that come into our map almost in real time, right? So what I've got here is a feature layer. This is an ESRI object, right? Called a feature layer. And the URL is coming from my config file, and I've set the ID and its mode and an info template. And then we're going to add this thing to the map, and then we're going to set an interval where we're going to refresh it every 5 seconds, right? Just so that while you guys are typing stuff in, you can kind of see the map come up. So let me highlight this, go back to the controller, and just let's put this thing in here. Let's save that. Now let's come and refresh our app here. All right.
What's the URL?
All right, so the URL, looks like someone's already been playing with it. Is that you guys? Yeah. All right, so we're going to do a tiny URL. It's not very good pen. I'll probably just tell it to you, but so it's tinyurl.com/stljsmap. Right? Yeah. All right. Now this little app that you're going to see in your browser, this is actually using dojo.x.mobile. This is Dojo's mobile framework, very akin to jQuery mobile, right? Again, Dojo has everything in there that you can need. So again, Gavin actually wrote this little mobile app really fast. I think probably just in a couple hours, so it's not by any means bug-free, right? But
Everything I write is bug-free.
that's true. I stand corrected.
Bugs
Yep.
are free.
So I can see someone added another one there. Oh, we got a couple more.
I could crash and start.
Let me zoom in.
It's not loaded for me. It took a minute, but it took a moment to get there.
Or maybe I'll move this over a little bit. So we got a lot of Illinois people. Oh, there's someone from Florida just came in. Michigan. Nice. All right, so you can see that's kind of fun, right? So to kind of close here, and well, actually, we can leave this up running on our server so you guys can use it in the future if you want. we set up a cookie so that you can only enter your address once unless you clear your cookies, right? So if you go back to that app later, it'll take you right to the map. All right, well, let me just finish really quickly. Actually, I think that's it. Have anything else in here? I was going to just point out the Dojo documentation really quickly. You guys can all go out to the website and check it out yourself, right? Dojo's got a really nice documentation tab, tons of tutorials that go over everything to get you started. They also have a really nice resource center, resource guide that actually gives you real examples of every method call, right, that you can do, right? So an example of that would be like this, for example, with this is dojo.hitch, right? So it has a nice little code sample here of how you would use hitch and a nice discussion about it and a live example. They also have the API browser. This is cool because you have the whole namespace over here. You can traverse the namespace, look at each object, its methods, its properties, and so on, right? So a quick example of that is this would be dojo.create, right? So we can see right here it's got 4 parameters, the DOM node, an attributes object, a reference node, and then the position, right? So then again, some examples of that, right? So very good documentation, lots of stuff out there. And then lastly is the actual, if you go to download.dojo.toolkit.org, you'll see this page, and this is where you can actually download Dojo, different versions. The reason why I point this out is because this is unminified, and they have a test for every single digit and object and everything, a test page. So you can actually go to that test page and have a look at how you would use that object, like a real code example of how you would use that. Right? So for example, the theme tester, right, is a great one. So let me just quickly, actually go to Chrome. So we'll go to download, dojo.toolkit.org. Let's go to 1.8, and we'll go to this release folder here. We'll go into digit. We'll go into themes, and we have this theme tester. So let's load this thing up real quick. What the theme tester does is it takes all the widgets in the Dojo digit namespace, throws them into one page. Here they all are. You can just check them out, right? We got accordion panes. We got trees. We got trees with roots. We got rootless trees. We got pop-ups. We got dialogues. We got menus. You got tab containers.
It's like .NET for JavaScript.
Yeah, you got menus with sub-menus. Tab containers, color pickers, calendars, right? So there are 4 out-of-the-box themes with Dojo. You've got one called Nilo, Cioria, Tundra, and Claro. What you're seeing now, this blue, that's Claro. Let me show you another theme. What's this one? Cioria. It's also blue, but a little bit different. Let's look at Tundra. Kind of more black and basic. Tundra is actually the original theme that Dojo had when it first came out, and Nilo again is another kind of grayish or blackish theme, right? So again, if you just need to do some rapid development with some really nice UI digits, right? The digit framework is great for that. And there's some themes you can pick from, right? So that's kind of Dojo in a nutshell. There's tons more we could go into, but we just don't have time for. But we'll open up for any questions that anybody has.
How do you find, how hard is it to debug Dojo? I mean, in other words, when stuff starts breaking, you've got something complex like that theme where you've hooked up the mouse clicks to the functions you're writing, things start going wrong. How do you track it down? How much does Dojo help you? How much of it is just becoming a very adept user of Firebug and those kind of things?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question. I mean, I think we all have our own styles of kind of debugging, right? For me, it's Firebug, right? I mean, that's my bread and butter, right? It's Firebug, and so I push my controller out to app so I can do app, and I interrogate that thing, and I see what's going on. I can set some watch variables, whatever. Aptana Studio does have a nice debugging system. I don't know if you guys use Aptana, but it has a nice debugger in it. You can actually set breakpoints, and if you're using Firefox, it has a little plug-in there that allows you to attach on those things.
So general purpose tools are enough. I mean, you don't have to do something special to
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
What's the performance like when you, is there a way to compile the JavaScript?
Yes.
Or does it get too big? How does the AMD work? Do you have to lag when you click a button and you gotta load a new script? Can you go into just really quick your experience with the performance?
Sure. It's a great question, right? So all that code you saw me today, like if you were to deploy that as is, it's not a good idea, right? Because it's not built, right? So the nice thing about Dojo is they actually have a web builder, right? So this is really cool. You can just come to the website, you can give it reference to your files that you're using, and it'll go through and look at all of the classes you're using, and it'll build that for you into one nice minified small file. So you just load that one file and boom, you're on your way, right? For better performance. Now, because Dojo is all open source, the problem with the web builder is, right, that if you have your own custom classes you're building, it's kind of hard to make that work from the web here, right? So you can actually, it's on GitHub, you can go out there, you can actually download the web builder, set it up on your own thing, include your own classes, and have those in your build as well, right? So that's pretty cool. Right? So again, like this is real simple, right? I can just say, oh, I want a calendar, I want this, I want that, and then build it, right?
And ultimately, like, what's the size of the, do you have one or two JS files you'll end up with, and how many kilobytes are you looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends, you know, how big your app is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, I mean, like the kernel itself, the Dojo kernel, let's see, is it on their website? I want to say the kernel it's like, I don't even want to say because I don't know for sure. Nano core, 3.8 kilobytes for the nano core.
Oh, wow, that's tiny.
Yeah. That's just like the core by itself, you know.
Because they'll separate it out into small pieces.
Right, all the modules, yeah.
Who maintains it? Is there a foundation or is it a company? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's the Dojo Foundation. So SitePin, let's see, how do you describe this? SitePin is a company, and they, you can hire them to build you sites or to consult with Dojo. They actually do Dojo workshops up here. You can go to a class and learn Dojo. So that's SitePin. That's kind of the public, for money side of it. But they also have the Dojo Foundation, which is the foundation that maintains Dojo that all the committers are members of, right? I don't know if that answers your question.
Did SitePen exist before? That was like where they created it and then they spun it out into a foundation, or?
I believe so, yeah. I'm not up on all the history exactly, but.
Or do you see it as, even though there's other things coming out that replicate some of these pieces of functionality, do you see it growing and continuing on? What's the future of that?
And here's the Dojo Foundation.
Gotcha.
Yeah, similar question to you. I'm curious as to why we're not all using this instead of jQuery.
Yeah, I am too. It's a great question. I think here's one, from my perspective, one reason why, because several years ago, or even a year ago, I heard this complaint that said, well, Dojo looks great, I'd like to use it, but there's just not good documentation, There's tons of good documentation for jQuery, but when I try to use Dojo, and I try to find good documentation, I can't find it. Now, a year ago, that was true. But you saw all the documentation I just showed you, that's all been created in the last year or so, and it's very well documented now. Actually, I'd say a year and a half, 2 years ago. Time goes fast, but so that used to be the complaint for it, but anymore, that's not true.
So I was using it in like 2008, 2009, before we had jQuery at the time, but I guess one difference was some people like Dojo for this reason more, and some wouldn't. I moved away from the idea of carrying for classical inheritance models in JavaScript, and it very much embraces that model. So if you like that model, you'll probably like Dojo, but if you don't, it's a real point.
A couple guys in our team, like David over here, he came from the C# world, .NET, and he really likes Dojo because to him, if he feels more at home, right, creating his own classes and this idea of inheritance, and to him it just kind of clicks in his head and makes sense, right? Using Dojo that declare, right? Now again, I think that model has changed though with the advent of AMD and Dojo. It's all, all the toolkits, even jQuery is implementing AMD and all this stuff, right? So I think that stuff is kind of changing. What I did want to show was Let's see. Is it this one? Yeah, so this was done a while ago, but comparing the speed of Dojo, jQuery, MooTools, prototype, right? So Dojo is the blue one, and shorter is faster, right? So you can see that across the board in all browsers, Dojo is always faster.
What are they testing?
They are testing, I believe, like dojo.query, like the CSS selection. So,
What's the community around Dojo like? I mean, IRC channel, discussion groups. I mean, what, you know, how do you interact with other Dojo developers?
great question. Let me go to the homepage here, dojo.toolkit.org. If you type in chat, they have this IURC channel. You can connect on Freenode.
Oh yeah, they're on Freenode.
Yeah, they're on Freenode. I use this little web chat a lot. This is nice. You can jump in there if you're banging your head on something. All the committers, they hang out here all day long. I don't know what they do. They just code dojos. But it's nice to have access to the committers. You know, they're like, oh yeah, you know, this is what you got to do. So that's nice.
Sweet.
Their dev mailing list is pretty good too. I've emailed them and I've gotten back pretty quickly. So.
Yeah. There's also SVN, right? Isn't it Dojo? Yeah, SVN, dojo.org, of course. So if you're really hardcore, you can check out the
They're
latest.
on GitHub?
I think they are too, aren't they? Oh, that's a good question.
Have any of the core pieces of Dojo, I mean, some of the tools for declaring classes and things like that, have they found home or usage in Node.js, you know, or is it very much chained to the DOM? Now, I'm totally unaware of Dojo Node hybrids, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody anyway.
Yeah, on the homepage.
Oh, okay.
supporting Node, yeah. There is a port of Dojo to Node. You can actually get it on NPM. Yep.
Wow, cool.
Yep. I haven't actually done that myself. I haven't used it there, but you can do it. So yeah. Well, if there's any other questions, we can hang out afterwards. Feel free to ask whatever. And again, I do have my card. Just one more plug for the position we're trying to hire, right? So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, give me a call. We're trying to hire some good people. So.
David, thanks so much.